Hi, Buddy Lindsay here from GoDjango.com. And last week in the video, I mentioned that when Django 1.11 released, I would read the release notes if there was enough interest. There were several people that were interested, so since Django 1.11 was released yesterday, then I'm going to go ahead and read the release notes, and I might throw in some information every now and then, but I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum because I think this is going to take a while. There's quite a bit in here, so let's go ahead and get started. So, Django 1.11 release notes as of April 4th, 2016. Welcome to Django 1.11. These release notes cover the new features as well as many of the backwards and compatible changes you'll want to be aware of when upgrading from Django 1.10 or older versions. We've begun the deprecation process for some features. See the Upgrading Django to Newer Version guide if you're updating an existing project. Django 1.11 is designated as a long-term support release. It will receive security updates for at least 3 years after its release. Support for the previous LTS Django 1.8 will end in April of 2018. Now, probably the more interesting part is the Python compatibility section. Django 1.11 requires Python 2.7, 3.4, 3.5, or 3.6. Django 1.11 is the first release to support Python 3.6. We highly recommend and only officially support the latest release of each series. The Django 1.11.x series is the last to support Python 2. The next major release is Django 2.0 and will only support Django 3.5 and up. Deprecating warnings are no longer allowed by default. Unlike older versions of Django, Django's own deprecation warnings are no longer displayed by default. This is consistent with Python's default behavior. This change allows third-party apps to support both Django 1.11 LTS and Django 1.8 LTS without having to add code to avoid deprecation warnings. Following the release of Django 2.0, we suggest that third-party app authors drop support for all versions of Django prior to 1.11. At that time, you should be able to run your packages tests using Python -WD, so the deprecation warnings do appear. After making the deprecation warning fixes, your app should be compatible with Django 2.0. So what's new in Django 1.11? Class-based model indexes. The new Django.db.models.indexes module contains classes which ease creating database indexes. Indexes are added to models using the meta.indexes option. The index class creates a B-tree index as if you used db-index on a model field or the index together on the model meta class. It can be subclassed to support different index types such as GIN-index, GIN index. It also allows defining the order, ascending or descending, for the columns of the index. Template-based widget rendering. To ease customizing widgets, form widget rendering is now done using the template system rather than in Python. See the form rendering API. You may need to adjust any custom widgets that you've written for a few backwards incompatible changes. Subquery expressions. The new subquery and exists database expressions allow creating explicit subqueries. Subqueries may refer to the fields from the outer query set using the outer ref class. Now moving on to the minor features, we're going to start with django.contrib.admin. ModelAdmin.dateHierarchy can now reference fields across relations. The new ModelAdmin.getExclude hook allows specifying the exclude fields based on request or model instance. The pop-up response HTML template can now be overridden per app, per model, or by setting the ModelAdmin.popUpResponse template attribute. I'm actually probably going to have to research that one because I've not seen that before. I'm curious what exactly it is. Anyway, moving on to Django.contrib.auth, the default iteration count for the PBKDF2 password hasher is increased by 20%. The login view, logout view, class-based views supersede and the deprecated login and logout function-based views. This is what I was talking about last week, where many of the function-based views for Django Contrib Auth have been moved to class-based views. The password change view, password change done view, password reset view, password reset done view, password reset confirm view, and password reset complete view class-based views supersede the deprecated password change done, password reset done, password reset confirm, and password reset complete function-based views. The new post reset login attribute for the password reset confirm view allows automatically logging in a user after a successful password reset. That's cool. If you have multiple authentication backends configured, use the post reset login backend attribute to choose which one to use. To avoid the possibility of leaking a password reset token via the HTTP referrer header, for example, if the reset page includes a reference to CSS or JavaScript hosted on another domain, the password reset confirm view, but not the deprecated password reset confirm function-based view, stores the token in a session and redirects it to itself to present the password change form to the user without the token in the URL. Update session auth hash function now rotates the session key to allow a password change to invalidate stolen session cookies. The new success URL allowed hosts attribute for the login view and logout view allows specifying a set of hosts that are safe for redirecting after the login and logout. That's kind of a cool security feature to add in. Added password validators help text to user creation form. The HTTP request is now passed to the authenticate, which in turn passes it to the authentication backend if it accepts a request argument. The user login failed signal now receives a request argument. Password reset form supports custom user model that use an email field named something other than email. Set the custom user.email field to name the field. The get user model can now be called at import time, even in the modules that define the models. My assumption based on that, there's some sort of lazy loading going on there, allowing that to happen, much like when we had reverse and reverse lazy for dealing with URLs. Moving on, Django.contrib.content types. When stale content types are detected in the remove stale content types command, there's now a list of related objects such as the auth.permissions that will also be deleted. Previously, only the content types were listed, and this prompt was after the migrate rather than the separate command. Django.contrib.gis. The new geogeometry from GML and the OGR geometry from GML methods allow creating geometries from GML. Added support for the dwithin lookup in spatial light, and the area function, distance function, and distance lookups now work with geodetic coordinates in spatial light. The OpenLayers-based form widgets now use openlayers.js from cdn.jscloudflare.com, which is more suitable for production use than the old openlayers.org source. They are also updated to use OpenLayers 3. PostGIS migrations can now change field dimensions. Django has added the ability to pass in size, shape, and offset parameters when creating GDAL raster objects. They've also added spatial light support for the isValid function, the makeValid function, and the isValid lookup. There's also added Oracle support for ASGML function, bounding circle function, isValid function, and isValid lookup. Next, we'll look at Django contrib.postgres. The new distinct argument and string ag determines if concatenated values will be distinct. The new GIN index and BRIN index classes allow the GIN and the BRIN indexes in the database. JSON field accepts a new encoder parameter to specify a custom class to encode data types not supported by the standard encoder. The new CI text mixin and the CI text extension migration operation allows using PostgreSQL's CI text extension for case-insensitive lookups. 3 fields are provided: CI care field, CI email field, and CI text field. There's the new JSON BAG allows aggregating values as a JSON array. Finally, hstore field and hstore field allow storing null values. I just read the two of the same thing. One is on a field in the forms, and one is on the Postgres fields. Okay, so the hstore field from the Postgres field and the hstore field for forms allow strings to have null values. That could probably be edited better. I might make a recommendation to that. The cache. Memcached backends now pass the contents of options as keyword arguments to client constructors, allowing for more advanced control of client behavior. See the cache arguments documentation for example. Memcached backends now allow defining multiple servers as comma delimited strings in location for convenience with third-party services that use strings in environment variables. Next is CSRF. Added the CSRF use session settings to allow storing CSRF tokens in the user's session rather than in a cookie. So move on to database backends. They've added the skip locked argument to the query set.select for update on PostgreSQL 9.5 Plus and Oracle to execute queries with for, update, skip, and locked. Added the test template setting to PostgreSQL's users specify a template for creating the test database. QuerySet.iterator now uses server-side cursors on PostgreSQL. This feature transfers some of the worker memory load used to hold query results to the database and might increase database memory usage. Added MySQL support for isolation level option in options to allow specifying the transaction isolation level to avoid possible data loss. It's recommended to switch from MySQL's default level repeatable read to read committed. And I've also added support for CX Oracle 5.3. Next we'll move on to email. Added the email use local time setting to allow sending SMTP date headers in the local time zone rather than in UTC. The email message object's attach method and the attach file function now fall back to a MIME type of application/octet stream when binary content that can't be decoded as UTF-8 is specified for a text/all attachment. In file storage, to make it wrappable by io.textio wrapper, file now has a readable, writable, and seekable methods. In forms, the new characterfield.emptyValue attribute allows specifying the Python value to be used to represent empty. The new form.getInitialForField method returns initial data for a form field. In internationalization, number formatting and number grouping settings support non-uniform digit grouping. With management commands, the new load data exclude option allows excluding models and apps while loading data from fixtures. The new diff settings default option allows specifying a setting module other than Django's default settings to compare against. App labels arguments now limit the show migrations plan output. In migrations, they've added support for serialization of UUID.UUID objects. Next, we'll move on to models. There's a number of these. They have added support for callable values in the defaults argument of querySet.updateOrCreate and getOrCreate. Image field now has a default validate image file extension validator. That's kind of interesting. They've added support for time truncation to trunk functions. Added the extract week function to extract week from date field and date time field and exposed it through the week lookup. Added trunk time function to truncate date time field to its time component and exposed it through the time lookup. Added support for expressions in querySet.values and values_list function. Added support for query expressions on lookups that take multiple arguments, such as range. You can now use the unique equals true options with file field. added nulls first and nulls last parameters to expression.ascend and descend to control the ordering of null values. The new fExpression bit left shift and bit right shift methods allow bitwise shift operations. Finally, they've added querySet.union, intersection, and difference. If we move to request and responses, they've added queryDict.FromKeys. Also, common middleware now sets the content length response header for non-streaming responses. They've added secure HSTS preload setting to allow appending the preload directive to the strict transport security header. Finally, conditional get middleware now adds the etag header to responses. In serialization, the new Django.core.serializers.base.serializer.stream_class attribute allows subclasses to customize the default stream. So in the base serializer class, there is a stream_class attribute that you can set if you inherit from the base serializer. The encoder used by the JSON serializer can now be customized by passing in the CLS keyword argument to serializers.serialize function. Django JSON encoder now serializes time delta objects used by duration field. I've not heard of duration field. I'm going to have to check that one out. In templates, there's a mark safe function that can now be used as a decorator. The Jinja 2 template backend now supports context processors by setting the context processors option in options. The regroup tag now returns named tuple instead of dictionaries, so you can unpack the group object directly in a loop. As an example, you can do for grouper list in regrouped. They have added a reset cycle template tag to allow resetting the sequence of the cycle template tag. You can now specify specific directories for a particular file system loader. In the realm of tests, they've added discoverRunner.getTestRunner quarks to allow customizing the keyword arguments passed to the test runner. We've also added the test debug mode option to help troubleshoot test failures by setting debug setting to true. That's cool. So you set debug mode and it forces the debug setting to be true for the run of those tests. The new Django.test.utils.setup database was moved to Django.test.runner, and teardown databases functions makes it easier to build custom test runners. We've added support for unit test.testcase.subtest when using the test parallel option. The Discover Runner object now runs the system checks at the start of a test run, override the discoverRunner.runChecks method if you want to disable that. Finally, with validators on the new features, they've added a file extension validator to validate file extensions and the validate image file extension. So now we're done with the minor new features, and now we're moving on to backward incompatible changes in Django 1.11. First, we're going to start off with Django.contrib.gis. To simplify the code base, and because it's easier to install than when contrib.gis was first released, GDAL is now a required dependency for GoDjango. In older versions, it's only required for SQLite. The contrib.gis.maps is removed as it interfaces with a retired version of the Google Maps API and seems to be unmaintained. If you're using it, let us know. The geometry equality operator now also compares SRID. The OpenLayers-based form widgets now use OpenLayers 3, and the GIS/OpenLayers.html and GIS/OpenLayers-OSM.html templates have been updated. Check your project if you subclass these widgets or extended the templates. Also, the new widgets work a bit differently than the old ones. Instead of using a toolbar in the widget, you click to draw, you click and drag to move the map, and you click and drag a point a vertex, or a corner to move it. Support for spatial light of less than 4.0 is dropped. Support for GDAL 1.7 and 1.8 has also been dropped. Moving on to Django.contrib.static files. Collect static may now fail during post-processing when using a hashed static file storage if a reference loop exists. Example, foo.css references bar.css, which itself references foo.css. Or if the chain of files referencing other files is too deep to resolve in several passes. In the latter case, increase the number of passes using the manifest static file storage max post-process passes. When using the manifest static file storage, static files not found in manifest at runtime now raise a value error instead of returning an unchanged path. You can revert to the old behavior by setting the manifest static file storage .manifest strict to false. For the database backend API, the database operations.timeTrunkSQL method is added to support time field truncation. It accepts a lookup type and a field name argument and returns the appropriate SQL to truncate the given time field name to a time object with only the given specificity. The lookup type argument can be either hour, minute, or second. The database operations.datetime.castTime.SQL method is added to support the time lookup. It accepts a field name, a TZ name argument, and returns the SQL necessary to cast datetime values to time value. To enable the for, update, skip, and locked support, they've set the database features.has select for update skip locked equal to true. The new database features.support index column ordering attribute specifies if a database allows defining ordering for columns in indexes. The default value is true, and the database introspection.getConstraints method should include an orders key in each of the returned dictionaries with a list of either ASC and or DSC, ascending or descending values corresponding to the ordering of each column in the index. InspectDB no longer calls the database introspection.getIndexes, which is deprecated. Custom database backends should ensure all types of indexes are returned by the database introspection.getConstraints. They renamed the ignores quoted identifier case feature to ignores table name case to more accurately reflect how it is used. The name keyword argument is added to the database wrapper create cursor method to allow usage of server-side cursors on backends that support it. They've dropped support for Postgres 9.2 and PostGSI 2.0. Upstream support for PostgreSQL 9.2 ends in September of 2017. As a consequence, Django 1.11 sets PostgreSQL 9.3 as the minimum version it officially supports. Support for PostGIS 2.0 is also removed, as PostgreSQL 9.2 is the last version to support it. Also, the minimum supported version of, I call it PsychoPG2 library, is increased from 2.4.5 to 2.5.4. The live server test case binds to port 0. Rather than taking a port range and iterating to find a free port, live server test case binds to port 0 and relies on the operating system to assign a free port. The Django live server test address environment variable is no longer used, and as it's also no longer used, the manage.pytest live server option is removed. Protection against insecure redirects in Django.contrib.auth and the internationalization views, login view, logout view, and the deprecated function-based equivalents and set language function protect users from being redirected to non-HTTPS next URLs when the app is running over HTTPS. I think that's a good security setting to have. Query set.getOrCreate and updateOrCreate validate arguments. To prevent typos from passing silently, getOrCreate and updateOrCreate check that their arguments are model fields. This should be backwards incompatible only in the fact that it might expose a bug in your project. I actually really like this feature that's coming because it would fail silently, and I've actually run into it and been banging my head against the wall for like a couple of hours before I realized I had a single stupid typo in a dictionary that I had. PyTZ is a required dependency, and support for setting.timezone equals to none is removed. To simplify Django's time zone handling, PyTZ is now a required dependency. It's automatically installed along with Django. Support for setting.timezone equals none is removed as the behavior isn't commonly used and is questionably useful. If you want to automatically detect the time zone based on the system time zone, you can use tzlocal. To do that, you can do from tzlocal import get underscore local zone, and then you set the time zone setting of capital time underscore capital zone equals get underscore local zone that you just imported function call dot zone. That should get you your local time zone. This works similar to settings.timezone equal to none, except that it also sets the os.environ.tz. Let us know if there's a use case where you find you can't adapt your code to set a time zone. There have been some HTML changes in the admin templates. The paragraph tag with a class of help is being replaced with a div tag to allow including lists inside of help text. The read-only fields are wrapped in div class read-only instead of in paragraph tags to allow any kind of HTML as the field's content. Changes due to the introduction of template-based widget rendering are next. Some undocumented classes in the Django.forms.widgets are removed. Subwidget, renderer mixin, choice field renderer, radio field renderer, checkbox field renderer. The choice input, the radio choice input, and the checkbox choice input. The widget.formOutput method is removed. Use a custom widget template instead. Some widget values, such as select options, are now localized in the settings.use localization equals true, or use L10N for the set Django setting. You could revert to the old behavior with custom widget templates that use the localized template tag to turn off localization. So I mentioned this one in my highlights last week. The Django.template.render method prohibits non-dict context. For compatibility with multiple template engines, Django.template.render must receive a dictionary of context rather than a context or request context object. If you are passing either of these two context classes, pass a dictionary instead. Doing so is backwards compatible with older versions of Django. Again, that's because the objects that were being passed in the context object and request context are dictionary-like objects. They implement some of the same interfaces that dictionaries have. And in fact, in the context object, I fixed a bug where it wasn't acting exactly like a dictionary. Model state changes in migrations operations. To improve the speed of applying migrations, rendering of related models is delayed until an operation that needs them. Example, the run Python method that you have in migrations. If you have a custom operation that works with model classes or model instances, the from state argument in database forwards or database backwards, you must render model states using the clear delayed apps cache method as described in the writing your own migration operation. Next, we're going to move on to the miscellaneous backwards incompatible changes. So, if no items in the feed have a pub date or updated date attribute, the syndicated feed.latestPostDate function method now returns the current UTC date time instead of the date time without any time zone information. And that's useful because of the time zone changes that we just went over. CSRF failures are logged into the Django.security.csrf logger instead of Django.request. I really like that because it allows me to get more specific logging output about CSRF only instead of getting everything about about the request. Allowed host validation is no longer disabled when running tests. If your application includes tests with custom host names, you must include those host names in the allowed hosts. See test and multiple host names. Using a foreign keys ID in the model_admin.list display displays the related object's ID. Remove the underscore ID suffix if you want the old behavior of the string representation of the object. In model forms, character field with null equals true now saves null for blank values instead of empty strings. I kind of went over this more in the previous highlights video. On Oracle, model.validateUnique no longer checks empty strings for uniqueness as the database interprets the value as null. So same thing as above. If you subclass abstract user and override the clean method, be sure to call super. BaseManager.normalizeEmail is called in the abstractUser.clean method so that normalization is applied in cases like model form validation. With email field and URL field, they no longer accept the strip keyword argument. Remove it because it doesn't have any effect in older versions of Django, as these fields always strip whitespace. The checked and selected attributes rendered by form widgets now use HTML5 Boolean syntax rather than XHTML's checked equals checked and selected equals selected. Related manager.add, remove, clear, and set now clears the prefetch related cache. To prevent possible loss of saved settings, the setup test environment function now raises an exception if called a second time before calling teardown test environment function. The undocumented date-time-aware JSON encoder alias for the Django JSON encoder, renamed in Django 1.0, is removed. The cached template loader is now enabled if debug is false and options loaders isn't specified. This could be backwards incompatible if you have some template tags that aren't thread safe. The prompt for stale content type deletion no longer occurs after running the migrate command. Use the new remove stale content types remove command instead. The admin's widgets for integer field uses type number rather than type text. Conditional HTTP headers are now parsed and compared according to the RFC 7232 conditional request specification rather than the older RFC 2616. The patch response headers function no longer adds a last modified header. According to the RFC 7234 subsection 4.2.2, this header is useless alongside other caching headers that provide an explicit expiration time. Example, the expires or cache control. Update cache middleware and add never cache headers function call patch response headers and therefore are also affected by this change. In the admin templates, the paragraph tag with class of help is replaced by a div tag to allow including lists inside of the help text. This is actually a duplicate of something I just read a little bit ago. Conditional get middleware no longer sets the date header as web servers set the header. It also no longer sets the content length header as this is now done by the common middleware. The get model function and get models functions now raises an app registry not ready if they're called before models of all applications have been loaded. Previously, they only required the target application's models to be loaded and thus could return models without all of their relations set up. If you need the old behavior of get model, set the require ready argument to false. The unused base command .can import settings attribute is removed. The undocumented Django.utils functional.lazy property is removed. For consistency with non-multipart requests, multipart parser.parse now leaves request.post immutable. If you're modifying that query dict, you must now first copy it. As an example, do request.post.copy. I really like this because it keeps the post as immutable so you can't change it, so you can have something to check any changes that you've made against the original to make sure you didn't mess it up too bad. Support for CX Oracle less than 5.2 is removed, and finally support for IPython less than 1.0 is removed from the shell command. So now we're moving on to the last section which is the features deprecated in 1.11. Starting off is the models.permalink decorator. Use the django.urls.reverse instead. For example, you would have potentially a class of myModel inheriting from models, And then you would have a URL method on that model, and you would return a tuple that has the name of a URL, and in an array you would have all the parameters for that URL. And then on top of that URL definition, you would have models.permalink, and Django read this as the permalink for that model. That's being deprecated in favor of just having a plain URL model and using the reverse function along with args with a list of what's needed for that named URL. To me, this is a cleaner implementation and something I have done for a long time. I guess I saw it by accident one day somewhere, and I was like, hey, I like that, it works, and totally forgot about the models.permalink even existing. So now to our last section is the miscellaneous deprecated features of 1.11. So to start off, contrib.auth's login and logout function-based views are deprecated in favor of class-based views, login view and logout. The unused extra context parameter of the contrib.auth.views.logout then login is deprecated. Contrib.auths.password change, password change done, password reset done, password reset confirm, and password reset complete function-based views are deprecated in favor of new class-based views, password change done view, password reset done view, password reset confirm view, and password reset complete view. Django.test.runner setup databases is moved to Django.test util setup databases. The old location is deprecated, so it's going from Django.test.runner to Django.test.utils. Django.utils.translation.string concat is deprecated in favor of Django.utils.text.formatlazy. String concat can be replaced by format.lazy. For the pylib cache backend, passing the pylib behavior settings as a top-level attribute of options is deprecated. Set them under a behaviors key with options instead. I have no idea what any of that just meant. The host parameter of Django.utils.http.isSafeURL function is deprecated in favor of the new allowed host parameter. I actually ran into an issue a while back with this isSafeURL, never could get it to work, and so I'm glad to see that allowed host is going to take over for dealing with that situation. Silencing exceptions raised while rendering the include template tag is deprecated as the behavior is more often confusing than helpful. In Django 2.1, the exception will be raised. Database introspection.getIndexes function is deprecated in favor of database introspection.getConstraints. The authenticate function now passes a request argument to the authenticate method of the authentication backend. Support for methods that don't accept requests, as the first positional argument will be removed in Django 2.1. The use etag settings is deprecated in favor of the conditional get middleware, which now adds the etag header to responses regardless of setting. Common middleware and Django.utils.cache.patch response headers will no longer set the etags when the deprecation ends. It's interesting. Model._meta.hasAutofield is deprecated in favor of checking if model._meta.autofield is not to none. Using regular expressions group of ilmsu pound in URL is deprecated. The only group that's useful is the $i for case-insensitive URLs. However, case-insensitive URLs aren't a good practice because they create multiple entries for search engines. For example, an alternative solution could be to create a handler 404 that looks for uppercase characters in the URL and redirects to a lowercase equivalent. The renderer argument is added to the widget.render method. Methods that don't accept arguments will work through a deprecation period. And with that, that is the end of the release notes for this major LTS release of Django 1.11. It's a bit of a longer video, and I hope it has provided some value. Some of the stuff I had no idea what it was, and I'm betting not many people know everything in here. And so I may have sounded like a deer in the headlights, if you can imagine a look of a deer in the headlights and somebody talking at the same time. Anyway, so don't feel bad if you don't know everything that's going on. I don't understand, some of the stuff going on, especially around the Postgres stuff and the GIS stuff, because I have not touched that stuff very much. So with that, welcome to Django 1.11. Go ahead and give it a download, give it a shot, and upgrade your projects. I will see you next time, and I hope you all have a good day, and I hope you enjoy Django 1.11. If this goes over well, then I'll definitely do it for Django 2.0, which I'm super looking forward to, because it's been a long time since we've had a major version release, and I think it's going to be a time to celebrate. With that, thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe and leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and have a good day.